So, yeah, my question was basically for you is that, I mean, does anybody come to mind, any kind of like class of people, occupation wise or behavior wise? Does that come to mind when I say something like the smartest of the average people or the dumbest of the smart people?
Um, Immediately I think of those like people who have bare minimum credentials, but because they sound smart, people are willing to listen to them, and therefore that's where they get their following from, like those
Well,
health gurus on you see on social media.
oh, I don't know if so who are you saying that sort of that would be like the smartest of the average people or what here?
I guess they would be like the smartest of the average people because they're clearly smart enough to sound smart and sound put together, but they're clearly not smart enough to actually be able to speak on the correct matters.
Yeah, I wonder if these guys really just range though, because that's kind of another thing is that the groups I'm thinking about are kind of really concentrated, you know? So if I think about attorneys, attorneys tend to go from the smartest of the average to, even the middle of the smart. Um, and, that's kind of a wide range, right? But I'm thinking people who are like almost strictly limited to a certain band. Whereas I think gurus are kind of all over the average intelligence spectrum, you know? Um, so to me, I think investors are the dumbest of the smart people. Okay. Which is not to say that, there aren't, attorneys who would match that or there aren't, um, you know, maybe professors who would also match that. Okay. But when we're talking about like professors, again, like attorneys, they're actually much wider. Whereas I think the investors class is almost solely concentrated in the dumbest of the smart people. Okay. Again, there's always individual exceptions. Um, but overall, if we're just thinking about general intelligence, okay, we're not thinking about like, oh, how good are they specifically as a doctor, specifically as an investor, right? We're talking about general intelligence, right? Overall, right? Combining your ability to read other people, right? What we might call social intelligence or EQ or whatever you want to call it, right? Street smarts, even your ability to you know, uh, do mathematics or your ability to verbally express yourself accurately, or your ability to come up with new ideas. Okay, I'm just talking about general, right? An intelligence that encompasses everything. Um, if we're thinking along those lines, I think investors almost necessarily have to be at the bottom of the intelligent or the smart group. Okay. Um, Now I mean, you probably don't have enough investment experience to kind of see why, but the thing about um, these investors is that they're not really good at actually thinking through chains of causation. Okay. What they see is some numbers, and then they see the general trend. They do what's called technical analysis, and then they put money into that. Okay. So they go ahead and put money into essentially trends. Okay. And I think that as a group, they have to be constrained to this because the moment they actually break out of that really constrained way of thinking, and they start to see actual connections, they're actually not going to be as good of predictors of the trend, right? Because the trend, if you go back to Plato's cave, right? Uh, the cave in Plato's Republic in book seven, okay, you have these people behind the prisoners who are chained, right? They can only see a wall of the cave, and there's light behind them. So there's people bringing objects behind it, and the prisoners can only see the shadows that are casted, right? And then they become very good at seeing the shapes of those shadows and predicting what kind of shadow shapes will come after, and remember what came before. This all sounds familiar years ago when you read The Republic, right?
Yes, very familiar.
So that's a great analogy for a lot of things, right? Socrates in Plato's Republic is really talking about truth, almost metaphysical truth. Okay. But we could also think about this as sort of economic realities. Okay. So if you are actually able to really see economic reality, that actually will detract you, as per the analogy of Plato's cave, from actually understanding what or seeing and predicting what those shadows are, right? Because in the story, one of the prisoners is freed. He goes outside. His eyes acclimate to the brightness of the outdoors, where the true sun is shining upon everything. And he sees everything into very clear detail after a while. But then he tries to go back into the cave to tell all the other fellow prisoners who are still chained what is going on out there, what the true objects must be. And they think he's crazy. And he has no ability, right? After coming back into the cave, this man has no ability to really see the shadows for what, to be able to predict the shadows anymore, right? Because his mind is now really understanding what's truly there. Okay. So that makes him ineffective in understanding, predicting, and interpreting and remembering the shadows. And a similar thing will have to happen with the investors class of people. Okay. Because in anywhere else, right, really understanding how things work pays off. Okay. If you're a physician, really understanding what's going on with your patient or not, that pays off, right? You see the results of it. In law, maybe not as straightforwardly because we still have to convince another human being, but it still to some degree pays off. However, really understanding what's going on economically, right? For example, you're Michael Burry and you're noticing that NVIDIA is investing in the same companies, giving money to the same companies who's buying from NVIDIA, right? I think that's called vendor investing or something like that. They always give fancy names for this, right? It's kind of like you see a flicker of the shadow, you give it a name, and it's meaningless, right? But you still give it a name. It gives you a sense of control, a sense of understanding over it, a sense of predictability over it. But what is vendor investing or whatever they call it? It's just a Ponzi. It's just a circular stream. It's almost like a self-cannibalizing Ponzi scheme in a sense, right? Okay, because let's say you are selling, um, you know, jewelry to jewelry stores, and then you give money to those jewelry stores to buy your products, right? In the short term, it looks like you're making lots of money. But long term, if nobody really buys those jewelry pieces, you're both out of business, right? You're both in a lot of trouble. Okay. So Michael Burry looks at NVIDIA, says, okay, I'm going to position myself to be able to make money as NVIDIA eventually goes down. Well, it's been a long time since he started doing that. I don't know how many years it's been, but it's been a long time and NVIDIA just keeps going up. Okay. They have this phrase, the market can stay irrational longer than you can stay solvent. Well, what does that mean? Right? It's just one of these catchy sayings, and there's a lot of catchy sayings in the world of investing. But really, it's just another way. I mean, the truth is the market is not rational. It's not rational short term. It's not rational even long term. Okay. It's just not rational, period. And that's what they should say is the market is irrational. Okay. There are certain signals that everybody can agree upon and rally around. Okay. Like if you notice day flies, right? They tend to gather around in certain areas, right? If there's a lamppost right there, not even in the day emitting light, right? It's just there. It just stands out. There will always almost be a cloud of day flies hanging out there because it's conspicuous. Okay. It has nothing to do with their ability to find other day flies to mate with. Okay. It just happens to be conspicuous, so they just gather there. So anything that they consider what's called fundamentals, like, oh, these guys have great revenue, this company has great earnings per share. That is not really anything but a very clear, um, conspicuous point that investors can gather around. Okay. Um, it's sort of another analogy that you could use is sort of like, okay, where are we going to meet, right? You know, you need to meet this person, but let's say your phones are dead, right? You go immediately, you think of the corner, right? You think of the corner because that's one way that would make sense, right? You're meeting somewhere on this very long street. At least let's just go check out the corner first. Okay. So there are certain natural things that draw people, and you can kind of agree. And that's why when we look at the stock price, going from 88 to 95 is not a big deal. Going from 95 to 99 is not a big deal. But trying to get above 100 is really hard. It has nothing to do with reality, right? It's just something, it's like a nice round number that people are afraid to cross. All right. So your ability to shut down your brain and just see what everybody else sees and not see what is true is served best in the world of investing. And that's why I think this class has to be the stupidest of the smart people, because you have to be smart to be able to do all this math and to predict trends and everything, but you can't be too smart. Okay, so do you see what I mean by the class is kind of locked into a certain sliver of intelligence?
Mhm. Yeah, makes sense.
Okay, so along those lines, I'd say there's actually a pretty good case for a certain other group, another occupational class, for the smartest of the average people. That, in other words, you cannot actually become smart. If you are smart, you will be bad at that job. You will be unsuccessful. So, what do you think? Can you, I don't know, give a try, guess what the smartest of the average people might be?
Not really, actually.
Okay. I would say elected politicians. You kind of see why?
Yeah, yeah.
So with the elected politician, right? You know, you need to appeal to the average person, like literally, okay? You need to appeal to them, but you also need to be smart enough to manipulate them, right? Any smarter, and you're going to be talking over their heads, okay? Any smarter, and you will not spontaneously connect with them, okay? And any smarter, you might actually get discouraged because you kind of realize you're just in it for the money, but there's easier ways to make money, right? And you are constantly confronted with the fact that the things that you say are just not true, right? And that creates a kind of schism, emotional distress within your head, right? So now some people like Henry Kissinger, okay, I hope you remember him from history. He's obviously highly intelligent, right? Um, but he could never really win an election. Okay, he knows what it takes, conceptually to or abstractly to win an election, but he himself cannot win an election. Okay, it's not because of how he looks or whatever, right? It's just in order to be that smart, you will not be able to connect with the common people that well. All right. Okay. Now, if you think about other groups, like teachers are just way all over the place, right? You actually have some teachers, they are the smartest of the dumb, the smartest of the average, and of course, occasionally you'll have them, be actually legitimately very smart, right? They're just kind of all over the place because that sort of idealism to be a teacher just attracts a lot of people. Okay, I feel like yeah, my intuition tells me that, that um, idealism is probably the most common unifying characteristic of teachers than anything else. Okay, mastery or intelligence or anything. Okay, it's idealism, right? The idea that what you're doing really does matter. It changes the future, even if it's one or three students at a time. Okay, so some of these other guys, right? They it's not like a certain kind of level of intelligence that unifies them. Okay, so what about the dumbest of the average? um, any guesses for that one, or any ideas for that one?
Uh, high school dropouts.
Hmm. Dumbest of the average. Wouldn't that be the smartest of the dumb or something? Or just kind of, I don't know. I mean, it just, high school is not hard to pass these days, and you get fairly well penalized for not graduating high school. So I think this is a pretty wide range here of lacking in intelligence. Um, I will say though that people who buy luxury cars that they really can't afford, right? I mean, it's one thing if you have literally millions and you're just like, yeah, sure, why not? Just buy a BMW, why not, right? But there are these guys that buy like, 60, 70K cars and all they do is deliver mail, right? All they do is deliver or work for FedEx or something. There's only so much money they can really make. Okay. That to me is the dumbest of the dumb because you really clearly can't do math. I mean, this is another thing. Like, just think about it too. Like, if you instead of buying this car and having these payments, take that money and invest it, and you'll make so much more money. But the kind of person, especially like, to some degree, I can understand if it's a young man, right? If you're a young man, maybe you've been convinced because out of naivety and inexperience, you have a cool looking car, you can attract or meet, more attractive women. Okay, I can kind of understand that because I think at some point every young man has kind of had that thought, right? Um, as advertising and so forth is effective and etc. But if you're a woman and you're really attracted to this car that you can't afford and you buy it, that to me tells me you are probably the dumbest of the dumb. Okay, why? Because you could have taken that money, you could have invested it even in something very basic like uh the S&P 500, right? Something very basic like that, very safe. And you could make so much more money that way. Okay. But you had to buy literally the one thing that is a depreciating asset, right? If you buy gold coins, that appreciates. All right. If you buy, uh, you know, collectible figurines, even that theoretically appreciates. And if they don't, it's not really, you didn't really lose too much. But the luxury car, whether it's a sports car or like a Mustang or a BMW or whatever it is, okay, this is the one asset that immediately depreciates the moment you buy it. And there's something else to be said about how ironic it is that like we're really obsessed with history, right? For objects, but even people like grades, it's basically a reflection of history, okay? But we completely ignore chastity, right? There's some irony there, but let's not touch that right now today. Um, but the dumbest of the dumb are those who buy these luxury cars when they can't really afford it. Again, it's one thing if you have millions and millions, right? But if you have like something like a 80K salary or even just only 120K salary, and then you buy a car that's 70K, that to me tells me overall you're a stupid person. Okay. So particularly if you're already past that, or if it's not really uh, even to impress women, right? Either because you yourself are a woman, or because you're just too old, right? You already have a woman, right? You're already too old for this kind of thing. You know, um, it's just really pointless. Like, why would you buy this? Okay, so enough on that. But I think that, I mean, would you agree that these are actually the dumbest of the dumb?
Yeah, it doesn't make any financial sense to me.
Yeah, it's just it's a total waste of money, you know? Okay. Again, it's the only thing that I can think of that is really that expensive and constantly depreciates. You know, everything else um historically appreciates, right? Land, it appreciates. A house, it appreciates, right? Um, if you buy gold coins, it appreciates, right? Even if you get a Swarovski figurine or a Yardo figurine, right? Those could potentially increase in value, right? Um, and even if they don't, they're not so super expensive, right? So all of that will appreciate, but your car won't. Okay. Um, and then you quickly get used to the coolness of that car. You really do, right? It's called the hedonistic treadmill. I don't know if that's the greatest term for it, but you know that's a famous term for it, and we can kind of use that for the time being. Let's go over and talk about the dumbest of the average. I would say that's probably actors, Hollywood actors, as a class. Can you kind of see why you would have to be that kind of sliver of intelligence, that you know dumbest of the average, in order to be a good actor?
Yeah, because you're portraying something you're not, and you're pretty much told what to say. You might have some intelligence of how to say it, but you're pretty much being told what to say. Obviously,
Yeah.
some actors it's a bit of exception because they have input in the script, so because they know how to write, I guess you can say. But for the most part, the typical actor, not the smartest.
Yeah, it's you know what? I think a great portrayal of this is in one of Ricky Gervais's works. The name escapes me for the time being, but it's um, you know, Ricky Gervais. He is the um, he and Stephen Merchant, I believe, created the original Office, which is originally British. And then they went on to work and develop other shows, but this one is about um, a character who is trying to get big in the entertainment industry, and so he runs into various you know famous actors like Patrick Stewart and Ian McKellen, right? And you know, this is something else that's a tangent, but I you know some of these guys are knighted, and yeah, knighting people for their ability to act is really questionable to me, and we'll talk about it maybe at some other point. But you know, overall, you want to give rank, right? And knighthood is a rank, okay? You want to give rank to those who are virtuous, not talented, but virtuous. And I have nothing against these actors. They are, I really actually like their acting. You know, I think they're greatly talented. Um, and you know, I do adore some of the characters that they've played. Um, but to give knighthood to them for simply on the basis of their talent is to really misunderstand the purpose of rank. Okay, the purpose of rank is to uh, identify people as role models for others. Okay, so just because you're a great pianist, you know, or a great actor does not mean you should have rank. Okay. All right. So anyways, that aside, there's a really funny scene where you know, the all of these actors, right, all these famous people are kind of playing either stupid or villainous versions of themselves. Okay, so you have um, Daniel Radcliffe, who played Harry Potter, you know, there, and he's playing this really awful version of himself, right? Anyway, so Ian McKellen, you know, he has probably the funniest scene in the whole show, and he goes, you know, he says very profoundly, um, "How did I know what to say? Because somebody wrote it down for me." Right? He's saying this as if it's revelatory, right? And it's very, it's really funny because, um, in a sense, right, acting is really kind of overrated. Okay, and if you look at Marlon Brando, and he kind of talks about his dog being the best actor he knows because he knows how to channel his motivation emotionally and manipulate it emotionally when he wants to eat. Okay, um, it really tells you what acting is really about. And like you said, it's all written for you, and yet you have to believe it, right? So you know something's about to happen, right? You know your character's about to die, and yet your character is not acting as if he's about to die. And so I think there's a kind of you know ability to shut out, kind of similar to the investing class, right? Without the math, though, there's an ability to shut out understanding of reality, right? And it helps if you limit your intelligence on purpose to do that, to pull that off. Okay. Um, so with actors, I think you get basically that kind of dynamic. And it's also interesting. I mean, some of these actors, like, um if you remember from The American Office, there's this character, Robert California, played by James Spader, I believe his name is. And if you hear an interview with him about this character, right, the character always knows what to say, right? It's actually largely incoherent all the time because he's so morally questionable, right? But there's a confidence and a seeming intelligence behind these words when Robert California speaks, right? He is eloquent, okay? And as you know from studying the Analects, just because somebody's eloquent does not mean he's true or right or correct or insightful. It just sounds like he knows what he's talking about, and he can be catchy. So eloquence is very close or adjacent to glibness. Okay, but if you actually hear James Spader talk about him, he's at a loss of words, and it's very jarring. Okay, between the character that he plays and his own eloquence. So I think that's really interesting there. Um, Now that kind of leaves the smartest of the dumb, and this one, I've kind of gone a little bit back and forth about it. But do you have any ideas of people who could be considered the smartest of the dumb?
Not really. Yeah, I can't really think of anyone.
Well, I think
Thank
you're gonna, if you start working around EMTs and medics, I say this is probably the smartest of the dumb people. And I mean, I used to do that work too, you know. Um, and I had a friend who was like, was um, like me at the time. I mean, he did actually become a doctor, but he was interested in medicine. Okay. Um, this experience uh, depressed me enough, not in a clinical sense, but um, maybe really rethink things because when you're an EMT working for a company that largely takes non-medical calls, you actually see just really the some of the worst of American uh, realities, social realities. Okay, so what I noticed is that like you have these problems, they have like these health problems, of course, but underlying those health problems are a lot of social problems. Okay, like their families are totally broken. These people are mostly abandoned or entirely abandoned. Um, they've got different addictions. Okay, as a way to cope with that, right? So what I really came to realize is that if I really wanted to help people, if I really wanted to do something heroic, I mean, there's plenty of smart people who want to be doctors, and they will be doctors, and then they'll serve in that capacity. And I wouldn't really be changing anything, right? I'd just be another smart person in that area. Okay. I think doctors are probably firmly, honestly, in the middle of the smart group. Okay. Almost firmly, right? Because if you get smarter than that group, it's going to be harder to stay as a doctor because you're just going to be more interested in other things. Okay. We kind of talked about Michael Berry, and he's kind of an exception a bit, at least in some specific ways. I mean, I think he's autistic, but Michael Berry is, smarter, much smarter than the average investor. Okay. He also used to be a doctor. Okay. Well, he kind of realized he's more interested in analyzing the market than continuing to be a doctor. Okay. So you see some of these people either before or after medical school, they'll think, okay, this is not really that interesting to me. and I'm going to move on. Okay. Because I think that's the thing. Like, in order to be highly intelligent, you have to also be curious, and you have to be willing to intellectually explore. Well, that makes it hard for you to just stick into medicine. Okay. Even if you are a surgeon, or um, even if you are even a brain surgeon. Okay. Because at some point it becomes feels more routine than anything else. And you might still stick with it just because of the money, but once you make that kind of money, it's also easier for you to leave, right? Eventually. So I think that doctors are pretty locked into the middle of the smart group. Okay. Um, but EMTs though, EMTs and medics, they're smart. They have some intelligence, but they also don't have the intelligence to move up, right? Like they can't become nurses, nurse practitioners, or physician assistants, right? I'm not saying you necessarily have to be a doctor, right? But you could be other things. You could be like a technician, right? You could be a um, this or that. I mean, there's other you know, we can say, paraphysician things that you can do, right? Just like there's paralegal things, right? There's paramedical um, occupations that you could do, right? So that's one possible candidate there. Another one that I've heard suggested, and this kind of goes back to the office, but I don't know if you noticed that like Michael Scott is like a really good salesman, but he's overall kind of dumb,
Hmm. Hmm.
right? Um, Salesmen, right? Really good salesmen in really specific areas can also be maybe the smartest of the dumb. You know, like they really know this area of products really well. They also know how to sell it. And they hone their craft very well, their pitches and so forth. But there's not a whole lot outside of that they're doing, and they seem to be pretty, um, satisfied with that. Okay, so there's a case to be made for that, though I think there's probably a bit more range with among those right people because sometimes sales really brings in a lot of good money, and so you have some people who are just honest about that, and they're like, okay, I'm just going to make this money, but I have my other interests on the side, and I'm going to write a book or something like that, right? Write a novel or whatever. So I don't know if that's really, but maybe the average might reside around there. Um, so, anyways, this all sounded kind of mean spirited, but it's really kind of an exercise, uh, not to judge every individual by this metric, right? I mean, like if I were to meet a salesman, right, or a politician or an actor, I'm not going to just pigeonhole him into this area, okay? But what you can, the purpose of this exercise is to look at a kind of occupation and understand the institutional constraints, limitations, and forms of that, um, suppose you could say activity, right? See where you are penalized, where you are rewarded, and that is the thing that's going to constrain the range of intelligence that you find in that area. Does that make sense here?
Hmm. Hmm.
Okay. And so really, this is not really an exercise to figure out who can we point at and laugh at and say, ah, ha, ha, this guy is not that smart, right? But it's really to predict the overall behavior, right? So when I say that the investor class is the dumbest of the intelligent, you have to understand that if you quote unquote outsmart the market, you actually won't make as much money as if you just follow the market, but get there a little ahead of most people, right? Because what does the market do, right? It's a crowd, right? And so it moves this way, it moves that way, right? And so if you invest in this stock right now, and then other people are, you get there before other people buy into it, you bought it at a lower price, and then other people buy into it, it raises the price, and then you could sell it, right? So the stock market is rewarding people who follow the trend but get there a little bit ahead of time. Right now, that sounds perhaps a little oxymoronic, right? But this is kind of where it really shakes out is if there's a trend and people are also kind of cautious, right? Like, oh, I don't know if this AI thing will really shake out. But you kind of see that, right? You still follow the trend because the trend is AI, but you get there earlier because you have less of a um, uh, you worry less about the risk, let's say, right? So you just get there earlier, okay? So that is, how that could work, right? You're still looking at it, you're still thinking in terms of a trend, maybe not predicting a trend, you're in the trend, right? You're mentally there, and then you just want to try to run and get there first, or before the bulk of people get there. Okay. So you have to have a good sense of trend. All right. And that's kind of my point there. Um, so whether you're talking about politicians, right? So another thing is politicians, right? You don't ever want to have thought, oh, Trump is playing 4D or 5D chess, whatever the meme was, right? Because you know by the fact that he could win, he can't be that smart, right? Same thing with Biden, Obama, right? The fact that they can win means they cannot be all that smart. So you can't really expect in America, you can't expect that these people will be very intelligent, right? That they'll come up with some great solution, some great 4-year plan. By the time he leaves office, it'll be fixed. No, you can't expect that. You can't expect that at all. Okay? At best, he'll be manipulated by really smart people that he happened to find, right? But those smart people will probably lack integrity, right? So you might have a Henry Kissinger, or you might have a situation like right now, right? But one way or the other, they're going to lack integrity, okay? Because in order to do that, you have to convince a guy who is not all that smart, and he himself is morally lacking in integrity because he can win elections, which means he's very good at flattering people, right? And so, in order to lie and manipulate to such a person, right, and flatter him, you yourself are going to lack integrity, or at least that person is going to lack integrity, right? Who's advising him. So that's the kind of reality that you're stuck with, right? It always surprises me when people look at actors and musicians and entertainers in general, and they're like, it turns out in reality this person's not a very good person, or he has some really wild or incorrect opinion, right? Morally, politically, whatever it is, socially. It it, it shouldn't surprise you because that class is just not going to have very intelligent people. Okay, it just basically can't. Okay. Um, Now, if you happen to know people who buy cars that they can't afford, right, this is also very helpful, right? You know, these are very low IQ people, very stupid. At best, they have some intelligence, but they're extremely impulsive. Okay. So I think that helps you understand what you cannot do with them. So the purpose of this whole exercise is not really to look down on people, but it's really to be able to estimate and predict their behavior. Okay, to have proper expectations, and that's really the major thing about morally judging other people, right? To judge other people is a self-defense preventative measure. Okay, it's not to be mean, it's to protect yourself and your family.